When my wife found out I had an incurable illness and only a year to live, she started cheating on me. I saw her with her lover, choosing a house they planned to buy with the money I would leave her. So I threw the divorce papers at her, announcing that the diagnosis was wrong. Now she is begging me to forgive her and not to go through with it. Look, I never thought I'd be the guy posting one of these stories on Reddit, but here we are. My name's Michael, I'm 42, and I run a logistics company here in Chicago. Always been a workaholic, you know? 14-hour days were normal for me. Coffee for breakfast, energy drinks for lunch, and whatever takeout I could grab on the way home. Classic American dream stuff. Work yourself to death to build something great. I always figured my health was bulletproof. Never got sick, never took sick days, barely even caught colds. My wife Linda used a joke that I was made of steel and stubbornness. Turns out, she wasn't entirely wrong about the stubbornness part, but the steel thing? Well, that's where this story gets interesting. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. I was in the office, going over some contracts with our biggest client, when this crushing pain hit my chest like someone dropped a bowling ball on me. At first, I thought it was just heartburn from the gas station breakfast burrito I'd wolfed down earlier. You know how it is. When you're busy, you grab whatever's quick and cheap. But this pain wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting worse. My left arm started tingling, and I began sweating like I'd just run a marathon in July. My secretary, Janet, she's been with the company for 8 years and basically runs the place while I pretend to be in charge, took one look at me and called 911 before I could even protest. The ambulance ride was a blur. I kept thinking about all the work I was missing, all the calls I needed to make. Priorities, right? Even when you might be dying, the American work ethic kicks in. The paramedics were asking me questions, but all I could focus on was the fact that I had a meeting with potential investors at 3 o'clock. The emergency room was chaos, like always, but they got me in fast when I mentioned chest pains. That's the magic phrase that gets you past all the people with broken fingers and mystery rashes. They hooked me up to more machines and a NASA launch, drew enough blood to feed a vampire, and had me peeing cups like I was training for some weird Olympic event. Dr. Patterson, the ER doc, was one of those guys who looked like he'd been working 36-hour shifts since medical school. He had that tired but competent vibe that you want in a doctor when you're potentially dying. After what felt like hours of tests, he came back with results. The initial tests showed some irregularities. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but concerning enough that they wanted to keep me overnight for observation and more comprehensive testing. Linda rushed to the hospital as soon as Janet called her. She looked genuinely worried, holding my hand and asking if I needed anything. The next few days were a whirlwind of specialists and more tests. Cardiologists, oncologists, radiologists. I met more doctors than I'd seen in my entire adult life combined. Each one had a different theory about what might be wrong with me. It was like being on the worst game show ever, where instead of winning money, you might win a terminal diagnosis. The waiting was the worst part. You know how Americans are terrible at sitting still? Well, multiply that by about 1,000 when you're waiting to find out if you're going to live or die. I kept checking my phone, trying to handle business from my hospital bed. Linda kept telling me to rest. But how can you rest when your entire life might be about to fall apart? Finally, Dr. Chun, the oncologist, came in with my results. This guy was young, probably fresh out of his residency, but he had that serious look that made your stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. He sat down next to my bed with a thick folder of test results and scans. He laid it out for me in terms that were both too clinical and too simple at the same time. Rare form of cancer. Aggressive. Stage 3, maybe 4 pending additional tests. The words hit me like a freight train loaded with anvils. 6 months to a year, maybe 18 months if I was lucky and responded well to treatment. I just stared at him. This wasn't supposed to happen to guys like me. I ate my vegetables sometimes. I walked to the coffee shop instead of driving. I'd even done a juice cleanse once because Linda insisted on it. How does a healthy guy in his 40s suddenly get handed a death sentence? Linda was crying. Real tears. The kind that make your mascara run and your nose all red. She kept squeezing my hand and saying everything would be okay, but I could see the fear in her eyes. 20 years of marriage, and now this. We'd always talk about growing old together, maybe retiring to Florida like every other middle-class American couple, playing golf and complaining about the weather. The drive home from the hospital was the quietest 20 minutes of our marriage. Linda kept glancing at me like I might spontaneously combust or something. I was processing everything, the treatments, the side effects, the financial implications. Cancer treatment in America isn't exactly cheap, even with good insurance. I was already doing the math on medical bills versus company assets. That night, Linda made my favorite dinner, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans. Comfort food, the kind of meal that usually made everything better, but I could barely taste it. Everything felt different now, like I was seeing my life through a different lens. The kitchen that had always felt warm and familiar suddenly felt foreign. Linda was being extra attentive, fluffing pillows and asking if I needed anything every 5 minutes. Part of me appreciated it, but another part felt like she was already treating me like an invalid. I wasn't dead yet, you know? I was still the same guy who built a successful business from nothing, who could bench press 200 pounds and change a tire in the rain. That first week after the diagnosis was surreal. I tried to keep working, but concentration was impossible. Every phone call felt pointless. Why stress about quarterly reports when you might not see next Christmas? I found myself staring out the office window a lot, watching people walk by on the street, wondering if they knew how lucky they were to worry about normal stuff like traffic and tax returns. The worst part was telling people. My business partner, Dave, took it harder than I expected. We'd built this company together from a single delivery truck to a fleet of 50 vehicles. He immediately started talking about restructuring, about making sure everything would be handled properly. I appreciated his concern, but it felt like he was already planning my funeral. My mom was a wreck when I called her. She's 87 and has survived 3 husbands, 2 heart attacks, and the Cubs winning the World Series. She's tougher than most Navy SEALs, but hearing about her son's cancer diagnosis broke something in her voice that I'd never heard before. The strange thing was how quickly life started revolving around the disease. Doctor appointments, treatment schedules, insurance calls. It was like cancer had become my new full-time job, and everything else, the business, hobbies, normal life, became secondary. Linda threw herself into research mode, printing out articles about treatment options and survival rates. Our coffee table looked like a medical library exploded on it. But looking back now, there was something about her behavior that should have been a red flag. Something I was too shocked and scared to notice at the time. Something that would make a lot more sense very soon. The first few weeks after my diagnosis, Linda was actually pretty supportive. She'd bring me my medications on schedule, asked about my pain levels, even rearrange her work schedule to drive me to appointments. I thought maybe this nightmare would bring us closer together, you know? Like those movies where couples face adversity and come out stronger on the other side. But slowly, things started changing in ways that didn't make sense. It began with small stuff. She'd forget to pick up my prescriptions, or she'd schedule her own activities during my chemo sessions. When I'd mention it, she'd apologize and say she was just overwhelmed trying to handle everything. Fair enough, I thought. The situation was tough on both of us. Then the phone calls started. Linda had always been social, but suddenly she was getting calls at weird hours. 10 p.m., 11 p.m., sometimes even later. She'd always step out of the room to answer them, claiming it was work stuff or her sister dealing with family drama. But here's the thing about being married for 20 years. You know your spouse's patterns. Her sister lived in Portland and never called past 8 p.m. their time because she had young kids. One evening, I was lying on the couch watching some mindless TV when her phone rang. She was in the kitchen cleaning dishes, and I could hear her side of the conversation through the thin walls of our ranch house. She was using that soft, sweet voice she used to use with me when we were dating, the tone that said more than words ever could. I couldn't make out specific words, but the rhythm of the conversation was all wrong for a work call or family crisis. There were long pauses, little laughs, the kind of intimate silence that happens between people who are comfortable with each other. My stomach started churning, and it wasn't from the chemo, When she came back into the living room, I asked who was calling so late. She didn't even look at me when she answered that it was her co-worker dealing with a project deadline. But Linda worked in accounting at a small insurance firm. What kind of accounting emergency happens at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday? The distance between us grew wider every day. She started working late more often, sometimes not coming home until after I'd already gone to bed. Our conversations became purely functional. Did I take my pills? Did I need anything from the store? What did the doctor say at my last appointment? The warmth that defined our marriage for 2 decades just evaporated. I tried talking to her about it one night. I explained that I was scared, that I needed her support more than ever. Her response floored me. She said I was being selfish, that I'd already told her I didn't want her to suffer alongside me, that I should give her some space to process everything. The problem was, I'd never said anything like that, not even close. That's when the paranoia started creeping in. You know how your mind works when you're already dealing with a life-threatening illness? Every little thing becomes suspicious. Was she really working late? Or was she somewhere else? Were those really work calls? Or something more personal? I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. Linda had always been meticulous about her appearance, but suddenly she was putting extra effort into how she looked. New perfume, clothes I didn't recognize, spending more time on her hair, and makeup even for regular work days. When I complimented her on a new dress, she got defensive and said she'd had it for months. But I knew that dress. I'd never seen it before in my life. The worst part was how she started talking about the future. Not our future together, but practical stuff. She asked about my will, about the business, about our joint accounts. She framed it as being responsible and prepared, but the timing fell off. We'd been married 20 years, and she'd never shown interest in the financial details before. Suddenly, she wanted to know about everything. One afternoon, I caught her on the computer looking at real estate listings in California. When I asked about it, she said she was just browsing, maybe thinking about a vacation after I got better. But these weren't vacation rentals. These were permanent residences, expensive ones, the kind of places you move to when you want to start a new life far away from your old one. The breaking point came about 6 weeks after my diagnosis. I'd been feeling particularly weak that day, so I stayed home from the office. Linda said she was working a double shift and wouldn't be home until late. I spent most of the day sleeping, but around 4 p.m., I decided to surprise her by having dinner delivered to her office. I called the insurance company where she worked, asked to speak with Linda in accounting. The receptionist was confused. She told me Linda had left early that day, around noon, said she had a family emergency. When I explained I was her husband and asked what emergency, the poor girl got flustered and transferred me to Linda's supervisor. Her supervisor was even more confused. Linda had taken a personal day. No family emergency, no work crisis. Just a personal day that she'd requested weeks in advance. My blood ran cold. Where had she been for the past 4 hours? And why had she lied about working late? That night, when Linda came home around 10 p.m., I didn't say anything about my call to her office. I just watched her carefully as she went through her usual routine of asking about my day and updating me on her supposedly busy work schedule. She was a better actress than I'd given her credit for. I started doing something I never thought I'd do in my marriage. I began investigating my own wife. I checked our joint credit card statements online. There were charges I didn't recognize. Restaurants I'd never been to, gas stations across town from her office, purchases at stores that didn't make sense for someone dealing with her husband's illness. The most damning evidence was a charge at a fancy steakhouse downtown on the same day she claimed to be working late because she was too tired and stressed to cook. The timestamp showed she'd been there during lunch, and the amount suggested she wasn't eating alone. My wife, who'd been bringing me soup and crackers because we needed to save money for medical bills, was having expensive lunches with someone else. I started pretending to be sicker than I actually was, just to see how she'd react. When I complained about severe pain or nausea, she'd show appropriate concern, but there was something performative about it, like she was checking boxes on a list of how a caring wife should behave. The spontaneous affection was gone, replaced by calculated gestures that felt hollow. The phone calls kept coming, and she kept stepping out to take them. Sometimes she'd go out to the garage, sometimes to the backyard, once even to her car in the driveway. Who needs that much privacy for work calls? I started timing them. These weren't quick check-ins or brief updates. These were long, involved conversations that lasted 30, 40 minutes at a time. One night, I pretended to be asleep when she came to bed late. She was on her phone, texting someone, and I could see the screen's glow reflecting off her face. She was smiling, not the tired, stressed smile of someone dealing with their spouse's terminal illness. A genuine, happy smile. The kind of smile I hadn't seen from her in months, maybe longer. The really messed up part was how she started talking about my prognosis. She'd asked the doctors pointed questions about timelines, about what to expect in the final stages. She wanted specific information about how long the treatments might extend my life, whether there were any experimental options that might give false hope. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, trying to prepare mentally for what was coming. But there was something about the way she asked these questions that bothered me. It wasn't the desperate hope of a wife grasping for any chance to save her husband. It was more clinical, like she was gathering data for a business plan. She took notes in a little leather notebook, wrote down dates and timelines with the precision of someone managing a project. I started having this horrible thought that maybe she wasn't hoping for a miracle. Maybe she was planning for the opposite. The idea made me sick to my stomach, but once it was in my head, I couldn't shake it. Every loving gesture started feeling calculated. Every expression concerned felt rehearsed. Things got worse when I noticed changes in our financial situation. Linda had always handled our personal banking, while I focused on the business accounts. She'd never given me any reason not to trust her with it. But when I asked to see our latest statements, she got defensive, said I should focus on getting better, and let her worry about the money. That response set off every alarm bell in my head. In 20 years of marriage, Linda had never been secretive about anything, especially not money. We'd always been partners in everything, made major decisions together, talked through our finances regularly. This new secretive version of my wife was like living with a stranger. I managed to get online banking access when she wasn't home and discovered she'd been moving money around. Not stealing exactly, but repositioning assets in ways that didn't make sense unless you were preparing for something. She'd opened a new savings account in her name only, transferred money from our joint checking account to pay off her personal credit card, and even made inquiries about life insurance payouts. The picture that was emerging made me feel sicker than any cancer ever could. My wife, the woman I'd shared my life with for 2 decades, might be planning for my death with the enthusiasm of someone planning a vacation, but I still didn't have the full picture. I had no idea how deep this betrayal actually went, or who else might be involved in whatever scheme was developing behind my back. The worst part was having to pretend everything was normal while this suspicion ate away at me. I'd smile when she brought me soup, thank her when she'd fluff my pillows, act grateful for her care, while wondering if she was counting down the days until she'd be free of me. It was like living in a psychological thriller where you're both the victim and the detective trying to solve your own case. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake at night, listening to her breathe beside me, wondering what she was really thinking. Was she planning a future that didn't include me? Had she already started building a new life while I was focused on trying to save my old one? The questions multiplied faster than the cancer cells I thought were killing me. But the answers I was about to get would be worse than anything I could have imagined. 2 months into what I thought was going to be my final chapter, I had to go back for follow-up scans. By this point, I'd been through 1 round of chemotherapy that made me feel like I'd been hit by a truck, then backed over by the same truck, then maybe stomped on by an elephant for good measure. The American healthcare system had turned me into a walking pharmacy, and I was spending more time in hospital waiting rooms than in my own office. Linda drove me to this appointment, but she seemed distracted the whole time. She kept checking her phone at red lights, and when I asked if everything was okay, she said work was just really busy. Funny thing about lies, once you start noticing them, they become impossible to ignore. Her work had never been that demanding before, but apparently my cancer diagnosis had coincided with the busiest period in insurance accounting history. Dr. Martinez was handling my case this time. Dr. Chun had moved to a different hospital, which should have been my first clue that something was off. Medical continuity is usually pretty important with cancer cases, but I was too focused on my own situation to question the change. Dr. Martinez was older, more experienced, with the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades of delivering both good and bad news. He spent a long time reviewing my files, comparing the original scans with the new ones, cross-referencing lab results with a thoroughness that seemed unusual. I was sitting there in one of those hospital gowns that never quite closes in the back, wondering if the news was going to be better or worse than expected. When he finally looked up from a computer screen, his expression was puzzled rather than grim. He asked me to describe my symptoms again, wanted to know exactly when they'd started and how they progressed. Then he asked about my original diagnosis, who had delivered it, what specific tests had been run. The questions felt more like an investigation than a medical consultation. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and said something that stopped my world cold. He told me he needed to run additional tests because my current scans and blood work didn't match my supposed diagnosis. In fact, they didn't show any signs of cancer at all. Not remission, not improvement from treatment. No evidence that cancer had ever been present in my body. I sat there staring at him like he'd just spoken in ancient Greek. How do you process information like that? For 2 months, I'd been mentally preparing to die. I'd been making peace with never seeing retirement, never holding grandchildren, never taking that cross-country road trip Linda and I had always talked about. Now, this doctor was telling me that maybe none of that was necessary. He explained that misdiagnoses happen, but usually with less clear-cut cases. My original test results had been definitive enough that multiple specialists had agreed on the treatment plan. But looking at everything fresh, with new scans and updated lab work, he couldn't find any evidence to support the original diagnosis. It was like the cancer had never existed. We spent the next hour going through every detail of my case. Dr. Martinez was methodical, professional, but I could tell he was as confused as I was. He ordered additional tests, different scans, consultations with other specialists. He wanted to be absolutely certain before giving me any definitive news, but his preliminary assessment was clear. I was healthy. The drive home was even quieter than the trip to the hospital 2 months earlier, but for completely different reasons. Linda kept asking what the doctor had said, and I found myself hesitating to answer. Part of me wanted to shout the good news from the rooftops, but another part was watching her carefully, looking for her reaction. When I finally told her there might have been a mistake, that I might not be dying after all, her response was strange. Instead of joy or relief, she looked almost disappointed. It was just a flash, gone so quickly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then she started asking detailed questions about how certain the doctor was, whether this might just be temporary good news, if there was any chance the cancer could come back. Those weren't the questions of a wife who just learned her husband might live. Those were the questions of someone whose plans had just been disrupted. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of everything was making me see problems where none existed. But that seed of doubt was planted, and it was growing fast. Over the next few days, while we waited for the additional test results, Linda's behavior became even more erratic. She seemed agitated, restless, like she was waiting for bad news instead of hoping for good news. She'd pace around the house, make unnecessary phone calls, and kept asking when we'd know for sure about my condition. The late-night phone calls continued, but now they had a different quality. Instead of the soft, intimate conversations I'd overheard before, these sounded urgent, sometimes even heated. I could hear her voice getting sharp through the closed door, though I still couldn't make out the words. Whatever she was discussing with her mysterious caller, they weren't happy conversations. I started paying closer attention to her daily routine. She developed new habits that didn't make sense. Suddenly, she was very interested in my business finances, asking detailed questions about life insurance policies, about what would happen to the company if something happened to me. When I pointed out that we'd already discussed all of this, she claimed she'd forgotten and just wanted to make sure everything was properly arranged. The breakthrough came when I decided to do something I'd never done in our entire marriage. I checked her browsing history on our shared computer. I felt guilty about it, but my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. What I found made my blood run cold. She'd been researching cancer survival rates, but not the kind of research a supportive spouse would do. She'd been looking up average life expectancy for my specific diagnosis, inheritance laws in Illinois, and how to contest a will. But the most damning thing was a series of searches about life insurance claims and how long companies typically take to process death benefits. There were also searches for apartments in other states, job opportunities in cities where we had no connections, and even some dating websites. My wife, who was supposed to be devastated about my terminal illness, was apparently planning her post-Michael life with remarkable thoroughness. I confronted her about the computer searches that evening. She tried to deflect, claimed she was just being practical, preparing for worst-case scenarios. But when someone's caught red-handed researching dating sites while their spouse is supposedly dying, there's no innocent explanation that makes sense. The argument that followed was unlike anything we'd experienced in our marriage. 20 years of built-up resentments came pouring out. She accused me of being a workaholic who neglected our relationship. I accused her of being a gold digger who was planning to cash in on my death. Neither of us was entirely wrong, but the timing made her accusations particularly cruel. What really hurt was realizing that my illness had revealed who she really was underneath the facade of a loving wife. When faced with the prospect of being a caregiver, of dealing with medical bills and uncertainty, she'd chosen to start planning her escape route instead of fighting alongside me. The final test results came back a week later. Dr. Martinez called me personally, which was unusual. He explained that there had indeed been a mistake, a significant one. My original tissue samples had been mixed up with another patient's at the lab. The cancer diagnosis that had turned my world upside down had never been mine to begin with. I was healthy, completely, totally healthy. The chest pains that started this whole nightmare had been stress-related, exacerbated by my workaholic lifestyle and probably too much caffeine. The kind of wake-up call that usually makes people grateful for a second chance at life. But as I hung up the phone, I realized I had a different kind of problem now. I discovered that my wife had been planning to abandon me during what she thought were my final months. She'd been researching how to maximize her financial gain from my death while pretending to care for me. The cancer might have been fake, but her betrayal was real. I didn't tell her immediately about the doctor's call. Instead, I spent the rest of the day thinking about what this all meant. Part of me wanted to believe that her behavior had been a stress response, that she just panicked and made some poor decisions. Maybe we could work through this, go to counseling, rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But deep down, I knew better. 20 years of marriage had taught me to read between the lines, and what I was reading wasn't pretty. Linda hadn't just been planning for my death. She'd been looking forward to it. The research about inheritance laws and life insurance wasn't preparation. It was anticipation. The hardest part was accepting that the woman I'd built my entire adult life around had been willing to let me die alone while she planned her future with someone else. Because by now, I was certain there was someone else. All those late-night phone calls, the new clothes, the secretive behavior. My wife was having an affair, and my supposed terminal illness had given her the perfect cover for it. When Linda came home that evening, I was sitting in our living room with a glass of whiskey, something I hadn't done since starting treatment. She asked how I was feeling, and I told her I'd gotten some interesting news from the doctor. The way her face changed when I said that told me everything I needed to know. She tried to look hopeful, but there was something else in her expression. Fear, maybe, or disappointment. She asked what kind of news, and I realized this was my chance to find out exactly how deep her betrayal went. So I lied. I told her the cancer was spreading faster than expected, that the doctors were talking about weeks instead of months. Her reaction confirmed my worst suspicions. Instead of breaking down or rushing to comfort me, she got this calculating look in her eyes. She started asking practical questions again, about my affairs, about whether I'd updated my will recently, about whether I wanted to contact a lawyer to make sure everything was properly arranged. My dying wife was making sure she'd inherit everything cleanly, and that's when I knew I had to find out exactly who she was planning to share my money with. I decided to do something that felt completely insane, but necessary. I was going to catch my wife in whatever she was doing. The next day, I told Linda I had a doctor's appointment and would be gone most of the afternoon. Instead, I parked down the street from our house and waited to see what would happen when she thought I was safely out of the way. Around noon, a car pulled into our driveway. Not just any car, a black BMW that I recognized immediately. It belonged to Rick Dawson, my former business partner, who I'd had to fire 3 years earlier for embezzling company funds. The same guy who tried to sue me afterward, claiming I owed him money. The same guy who'd made my life miserable for months with legal threats and harassment. Watch him walk up to my front door like he owned the place was surreal. This was the man who'd stolen from me, who'd tried to destroy my business, who'd call me every name in the book when I caught it with his hand in the cookie jar. And now he was walking into my house while I was supposedly dying of cancer. I sat in my car for about an hour, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe Linda was trying to reconcile business differences before I died. Maybe she thought it would bring me peace to resolve old conflicts. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, I knew those explanations were garbage. You don't invite your husband's enemy over for secret afternoon meetings unless something shady is going down. When I couldn't take the suspense anymore, I decided to go home early. I had my key, it was my house, and I figured I deserved to know what was happening under my own roof. The smart play would have been to call first, give them a chance to separate and come up with cover stories. But sometimes you just need to know the truth, even when it's going to hurt. I parked in the garage and entered through the kitchen, moving as quietly as possible. I could hear voices coming from the living room. Linda's laugh mixing with a deeper male voice I definitely recognized as Rick's. They sounded relaxed, comfortable, like this wasn't their first secret meeting. What I saw when I rounded the corner into the living room will be burned into my memory forever. Linda was sitting on our couch, the same couch where I'd been recovering from chemo treatments, with Rick's arm around her shoulders. They were looking at something on her laptop, heads close together, totally absorbed in whatever they were viewing. They were so focused on the screen that they didn't notice me at first. I had a few seconds to process what I was seeing before they realized I was there. My wife was cuddled up with a man who tried to ruin my business in my house, while I was supposed to be at a medical appointment for the cancer that was supposedly killing me. When Linda finally saw me, the color drained from her face like someone had pulled a plug. Rick tried to jump up from the couch. So fast, he nearly tripped over the coffee table. For a moment, nobody said anything. It was like we were all frozen in some terrible tableau. The dying husband, the cheating wife, and the scumbag ex-partner, who was apparently her new boyfriend. The laptop was still open on the coffee table, and I could see what they'd been looking at. Real estate listings. Not just any real estate. Luxury condos in Miami. Beachfront properties in California. The kind of places you move to when money is no object. They'd been shopping for their dream home, using what they thought would soon be my life insurance money. Rick tried to play it off like he was there on business, something about settling old debts before I pass away. But the man was sitting on my couch with his arm around my wife, looking at vacation properties they planned to buy with my death benefits. Even the smoothest talker would have struggled to explain that away. Linda attempted damage control, claiming Rick had just stopped by to check on how I was doing, that they'd been looking at the real estate listings to distract themselves from the sad situation. But I could see her laptop screen clearly. They hadn't been browsing randomly. They had specific searches saved, price ranges filtered, mortgage calculators open. This wasn't casual browsing. This was serious house hunting. The conversation that followed was probably the most honest one Linda and I had shared in years, which is ironic considering it was built on months of lies. She tried to maintain the charade at first, insisting that nothing inappropriate was happening, that Rick was just being supportive during a difficult time. But when I pointed out that this was the same Rick who'd stolen from our company and tried to destroy our lives, her story started falling apart. Rick, to his credit, at least had the decency to look ashamed. He mumbled something about bygones being bygones and how my illness had put things in perspective. Translation: he figured that since I was dying anyway, why not help himself to my wife and my money? The American dream, Rick style. But Linda's defense was what really got to me. She started talking about how lonely she'd been, how scared she was about the future, how she needed someone to talk to who understood business and financial planning. Apparently, Rick had been providing emotional support during my illness, the kind of emotional support that involved planning a luxurious retirement together. That's when the real truth started coming out. They'd been seeing each other since shortly after my diagnosis. Linda had reached out to Rick initially for financial advice, or so she claimed, about managing assets during a terminal illness. But their relationship had quickly become personal, very personal. Rick had convinced her that she needed to think practically about her future. A young, attractive widow with substantial assets would have options. He'd told her she shouldn't tie herself down with grief when she could start fresh somewhere warm and sunny. He'd painted a picture of a new life in Florida or California, far from the cold Chicago winters and the memories of her dead husband. The most infuriating part was how they'd rationalized it. Linda claimed she'd never stopped loving me, but that loving someone meant accepting reality. Since I was going to die anyway, wasn't it better for her to have someone to help her through the grief and the practical challenges afterward? They convinced themselves they were being responsible, planning ahead for an inevitable future. But here's where their practical planning had a fatal flaw. I wasn't actually dying. When I broke that news to them, the looks on their faces were priceless. Linda went from defensive to confused to something that looked almost like panic. Rick just sat there with his mouth open like a fish that had been yanked out of water. I explained about the mixed-up lab results, about Dr. Martinez's findings, about how I was perfectly healthy and would probably live another 40 years. The luxury condo shopping would have to wait indefinitely. The life insurance payout they'd been counting on wasn't coming. Their carefully planned future together had just evaporated. Rick was the first to recover from the shock. He started backpedaling, so fast he probably broke some kind of land speed record. Suddenly their relationship was just friendship. The house hunting was just casual browsing. Everything was perfectly innocent. He was practically running toward the door before he'd finished making his excuses. Linda tried a different approach. She broke down crying, claiming she'd been confused and scared, that she made terrible decisions while under stress. She begged me to understand that facing your spouse's death makes people do irrational things. She promised it would never happen again, that we could work through this together now that the medical crisis was over. But I'd seen enough to know this wasn't just stress-induced poor judgment. The level of planning involved, the financial research, the apartment hunting. This had been a calculated strategy. She'd been preparing to cash in on my death while pretending to be a grieving wife. The only thing she was really grieving was the loss of her financial windfall. The worst part was realizing how long this had probably been going on. Some of those late-night phone calls had started before my diagnosis. Some of the distance in our marriage had existed long before cancer entered the picture. My illness had just given her the excuse to act on feelings and plans that were already there. That night, after Rick had fled and Linda had exhausted herself with apologies and explanations, I lay in bed thinking about what came next. I was healthy, which should have been cause for celebration. But I was also married to a woman who'd been planning to profit from my death while sleeping with my worst enemy. The cancer might have been fake, but the betrayal was real, and it was metastasizing through every aspect of our life together. I thought about all the times over the past 2 months when I'd felt grateful for her care, when I'd appreciated her sacrifices to help me through treatment. Every gentle gesture, every concerned question, every expression of love had been performance art. She'd been playing the role of devoted wife while auditioning for the role of merry widow. The really twisted part was that if the diagnosis had been real, if I really had been dying, she would have gotten away with it completely. She would have been seen as a tragic widow who'd lost a beloved husband to a terrible disease. Rick would have swooped in as a supportive friend, helping her rebuild her life. They'd probably been living in that Miami condo within a year of my funeral. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. My fake cancer had exposed my wife's real character, and now I had to figure out what to do with that information. The old Michael would have tried to work things out, would have believed her tears and promises to change. But the new Michael, the one who'd spent 2 months thinking he was a die, had a different perspective on what really mattered. I was 42 years old, healthy as a horse, and married to a woman who'd been shopping for real estate with my life insurance money. It was time to make some changes in my life, starting with the biggest one of all. But first, I wanted to see just how far this rabbit hole went. I had a feeling Rick and Linda's partnership involved more than just emotional support and house hunting. Tomorrow, I was going to start digging deeper into exactly what they've been planning for my posthumous finances. And something told me that what I discovered so far was just the tip of a very ugly iceberg. The next morning, I called in sick to my own company and spent the day doing detective work that would have made Sherlock Holmes proud. I started with our financial records, cross-referencing Linda's story about Rick providing emotional support with a timeline of her suspicious activities. What I found was a masterclass in premeditated betrayal. The affair had started almost immediately after my diagnosis, but their financial planning had begun even earlier. I discovered that Linda had been in contact with Rick for months before I got sick, ever since she'd learned about some business difficulties I'd been dealing with privately. Apparently, my loving wife had been keeping tabs on our financial situation and sharing information with my former partner. Rick's involvement made perfect sense when I dug deeper. He'd never gotten over being fired, and he'd been looking for revenge ever since. When Linda reached out to him about my health problems, he saw an opportunity to get back at me while scoring a wealthy widow in the process. They'd been planning my demise like a corporate takeover, complete with asset allocation and timeline management. The evidence kept getting worse. I found emails between them discussing my daily condition, my treatment schedule, even my mood changes. Linda had been providing Rick with detailed reports about my health, like she was filing quarterly earnings statements. They'd been tracking my decline with the enthusiasm of day traders watching a stock crash. But the most damning discovery was a bank account I'd never known about. Linda had opened it 2 weeks after my diagnosis, and Rick had been making regular deposits. Not huge amounts, but consistent payments that suggested some kind of ongoing arrangement. When I traced the deposits, they came from a shell company that Rick had set up specifically for this purpose. It became clear that this wasn't just an affair born out of stress and fear. This was a business partnership designed to capitalize on my death. Rick was investing in Linda's future, and my life insurance policy was their projected return on investment. They'd turned my marriage into a hostile takeover, and I'd been too sick and trusting to see it coming. I spent another week gathering evidence before making my next move. I hired a private investigator, a former cop named Tony, who specialized in infidelity cases. Within 3 days, he had photos of Linda and Rick at restaurants, hotels, and even looking at real estate together. The pictures told a story of 2 people in love, planning a future together, celebrating what they thought was their upcoming windfall. Tony also uncovered Rick's criminal history that went beyond just embezzling from my company. The guy had been involved in insurance fraud schemes before, had connections with people who specialize in making deaths look natural. I'm not saying they were planning to murder me, but let's just say Rick had friends who knew how to speed up terminal diagnoses. Armed with this evidence, I contacted a divorce attorney. Barbara Chun, no relation to my original doctor, was a shark in a business suit who specialized in high-asset divorces involving infidelity. When I showed her what I discovered, she smiled like a predator who just spotted wounded prey. Linda and Rick had made some very expensive mistakes. After that explosive confrontation, where Rick fled like a coward and Linda was left scrambling for explanations, I spent the next few weeks digging deeper into their scheme. What I uncovered made their little affair look like child's play compared to the financial crimes they'd been planning. Rick and Linda had been setting up shell companies and offshore accounts to hide what they thought would be my inheritance money. Rick had convinced Linda that they needed to be smart about avoiding taxes on her windfall. Translation: they were planning to commit massive fraud using my death as cover. I discovered evidence of forged documents, fake business partnerships, and even preliminary discussions with some very shady characters about making my death look more natural than the cancer timeline would allow. These people weren't just waiting for me to die. They were considering ways to speed up the process. I took all this evidence to my divorce attorney, Barbara Chun, who practically rubbed her hands together with glee. What had started as a simple infidelity case had turned into something much bigger. We had them on fraud, conspiracy, and possibly even conspiracy to commit worse crimes. Linda's dreams of easy widowhood had turned into a legal nightmare. The divorce proceedings were swift and devastating for Linda. Not only did she lose any claim to my assets, but Rick threw her under the bus completely when the FBI started asking questions about their financial schemes. Turns out my former business partner was a career criminal who'd been using lonely, vulnerable women to commit fraud for years. Linda had just been his latest mark. She lost everything: the house, the cars, even her job when the insurance company learned about her involvement in potential fraud schemes. Rick disappeared entirely, probably to find another grieving spouse to manipulate in another state. Linda was left holding the bag for all their illegal activities. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, my doorbell rang on a rainy Tuesday evening. I opened it to find Linda standing there, soaked and shivering. She'd aged years in those few months. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes were clearly secondhand, and she had the desperate look of someone who'd hit rock bottom hard. She launched into this whole speech about how sorry she was, how Rick had manipulated her, how she'd been scared and confused and made terrible decisions. She claimed she'd never stopped loving me, that losing me had been the biggest mistake of her life. She begged for another chance, promised things would be different, said she'd do anything to prove she'd changed. I listened to her entire sob story, watching the rain drip off her hair onto my doormat. The old Michael might have felt sorry for her. The old Michael might have believed that people could change, that 20 years of marriage deserved another chance. But the old Michael had never discovered that his wife was planning to profit from his death. I looked at this woman who'd shared my bed for 20 years, who'd been planning to profit from my death while pretending to love me. The old Michael might have felt sorry for her. But the new Michael, the one who'd faced his own mortality and discovered what people really showed their true colors, had learned some valuable lessons about trust, and I told her the door to my house was closed to her permanently. No second chances, no reconciliation, no friendship for old time's sake. She'd made her choice when she decided my death was more valuable than my life. Now she could live with the consequences of that choice. As I watched her walk away, probably heading back to whatever cheap apartment she could afford on her accounting salary, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine freedom. My fake cancer had saved me from something worse than any real disease. It had shown me who Linda really was underneath the mask she'd worn for 2 decades. The ironic part is that my health scare had actually made me healthier. I'd changed my diet, started exercising regularly, reduced my stress levels, and learned to prioritize what actually mattered. I was in better shape at 42 than I'd been in my 30s, and I was finally free to build a life with someone who would value me alive rather than dead. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. My misdiagnosis had cost me a marriage, but it had saved me from wasting the rest of my life with someone who saw me as a paycheck rather than a partner. Linda and Rick had taught me an expensive lesson about trust, but some educations are worth every penny. These days, I'm dating again, taking things slow, and paying attention to red flags I used to ignore. I've learned that when someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. And if someone ever again seems more interested in my life insurance policy than my life expectancy, I'll know exactly what that means. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me through this crazy story from my life. I know it's a wild ride. Sometimes real life is stranger than fiction, right? What do you think about Linda and Rick's plan? Have you ever had someone close to you show their true colors during a crisis? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story resonated with you, or if you just want to support the channel, hit that like button and consider subscribing for more real-life stories that'll make you think twice about trusting people. Until next time, take care of yourselves out there.